Welcome. Thank you for joining our Laboratory Best Practice Series webinar. I'm Becky Melody, your hostess for today's presentation. Diane Gleinzer, our VP of Operations, will be presenting. The discussion today will introduce introductions, USDM at a glance, webinar logistics, and our discussion topic, regulatory compliance in the laboratory. If you do not see the presentation slides at this point, click on the Laboratory Compliance tab at the very top middle of your screen. Diane Gleinzer is the Vice President of Operations for U.S. Data Management. She has 22 years experience in quality assurance and regulatory compliance within pharmaceutical, biotech, and medical device industries. Diane is our Lab Practice Director, and she leads the USDM operations team. She's done so for over 10 years now, quite successfully. U.S. Data Management is focused exclusively in the life science domain. We're a market leader in providing IT, quality and regulatory compliance, professional service solutions. We're headquartered in Ventura, California, and we're a compliance partner for many best-of-breed vendors, including Agilent, QMOS, VMware, OpenText ECM, and of course Oracle and SAP. We've delivered more than 1,000 successful projects with over 130 life science clients, and we're a preferred compliance partner for small, mid-tier, and large life science companies. We specialize in assisting clients with reducing the regulatory risk while maximizing their investment in quality systems, ECM, laboratory instruments and systems, and IT infrastructure. Our directive is to simplify, unify, and optimize compliance as well as business objectives. The content of our presentation today will be covered in 30 minutes, and we do invite you to post questions for our team via the iLink message board that you see at the bottom left of your screen. You can go ahead and post your questions throughout the discussion, but we'll address them immediately following the presentation. If you're having any issues logging into the system, please turn off your pop-up blockers. That should help. And so you know, this webinar is being recorded and will be made available on our website. The overall goal of the webinar is to facilitate discussion, share ideas, provide the platform, and then get to the edge and explore the solutions together. Appreciate you taking the time to join us. And now I'll turn the presentation over to Diane.
Hello, everybody, and thanks for joining us today. All right, as Becky said, the agenda for today is to give a brief introduction on laboratory systems and compliance, talk about some recent regulatory changes that have occurred and that will affect you if you work in or operate a laboratory. Ask if you're in compliance now. How do you know whether or not you're in compliance now? And we'll talk a little bit about what compliance means. We'll also talk about how can you achieve compliance in a regulated laboratory, and not only how to achieve it, but also how to maintain it once you have achieved it. We'll talk a little bit about legacy systems. They're very important, especially in a laboratory situation. A lot of labs have older systems that may not be compliant with Part 11, and we'll talk about how to manage those. And then afterwards, as Becky said, we'll do some questions and answers. So let's get started. What does it mean to be compliant today in a regulated laboratory? It means that you have policies and procedures that have been implemented and that you follow them to make sure that the data that you generate in support of your regulated activities, easy for me to say, are accurate, convincing, and they're appropriate for the decisions that you're making from that data that you generate. It means that you have adequate training for the resources you use, and that they have the ability and the knowledge to be able to do their day-to-day job. It means that the data that you generate in for your regulated activities is protected and safe. What I see differ between organizations and industries from one company to another in laboratory compliance is that the approach that they use to demonstrate that their data is valid differs from one place to another. The amount of attention that they pay to their documentation and the amount of testing that they do when they do computer systems validation is different. How they monitor compliance over periods of time is different. And also where they place the most emphasis on compliance, whether it's their analytical instrumentation, the method validation, computer systems that they have in place, system suitability, etc. What happens if you're not in compliance? The first thing that can happen is that you're going to get a 483. If you don't comply with the findings or fix the findings that are issued in a 483, or if the situation is serious enough to warrant it, a warning letter can be issued. The warning letter is issued and you don't meet the terms of the warning letter, you can be disqualified if you're a GLP lab, disqualified from being able to participate in regulated studies. If you're a pharmaceutical or med device and you do quality control testing, there can be recalls. You can have the data that you've generated to support a new drug application be invalidated. I've even heard of one case where a laboratory was told they could no longer even supply data. They could no longer apply for new drug applications. So there are really serious consequences. In addition to these consequences, there can be legal consequences involved. So compliance isn't really your option. It's a legal requirement. Recently, there have been 3 changes in the regulations that will affect your lab today. And not only that, they're going to have a huge impact on laboratories in the future. The first change is that the FDA has updated its post-inspection 483 program. In the past, they've been kind of lax about enforcing the time period they gave you to respond to a 483. There have been extended time periods granted, 30, 45 days, 90 days. Sometimes they go back after one inspection, they'd go back a year later, and there wouldn't be any true consequences for not having complied with something that you said you were going to fix. They've changed their process now, and responses to 483s must be completed within 15 business days. Not the actions that you're going to take, but you have to respond on how you're going to act within 15 days. Very recently, they did tell a laboratory that they could not, or not, sorry, it wasn't a laboratory, but they did tell a company that they would not accept their response when they generated it more than 15 days outside of the requirements. So very critical that you are now in compliance. This is going to change the way labs operate, because if you're not in compliance and you get a 483, you're going to have a panic period after that 483 is issued when you only have 15 days to come up with your response. So you're going to have to increase the level of compliance that you're currently using today. In addition to that, the Part 11 inspection program started a couple of years ago, where the FDA came out and said that they were going to be tagging along, partnering inspectors who are going to be focusing on Part 11 compliance and Part 11 audits. And the goal of those audits is to generate or help the FDA generate their next opinion and their next interpretation of the Part 11 requirements. But they are issuing 483s. So you're going to see, as you get an inspection for some other item, you're going to have a Part 11 auditor tag along with that inspector. That hasn't been really happening very often in the past. This year they have kind of stepped it up a little bit, and it's going to happen more often in the future. And this has been a promise that the FDA has been making. So it will happen. In addition to that, as of July 1st, just a couple of weeks ago, the European Union GMP regulations were updated, and they became effective. And in those updated Annex 11 regulations, they've increased the regulations for computer system validation. They've now required a definition of raw data if you generate any data for regulated activities. Paper records generated by computer systems that laboratories have relied on in the past. I've talked to many labs who say that they've officially defined their paper records as the raw data, whether they're generated by a computer system or not. Now paper records are considered hybrid. There are no more paper records as an official raw data record. And for instance, the regulation states the printed chromatograms used in drug manufacturing and testing do not satisfy the predicate rule requirements found in 21 CFR Part 11. Big change from what we've been in the past. Are you in compliance now? The FDA, ever since Able Laboratories and Liner Health Products, 2005 and 2009, were convicted of fraud in reporting their data. They've increased their focus on data integrity for data that's generated in regulated laboratories. As a part of the ongoing Part 11 inspection program, FDA inspectors continue to focus on Part 11 requirements in addition to the standard predicate rule audits. And the new Annex 11 guideline that's in effect now focuses on the use of computer systems in GXP environments. And what we're talking about for GXP there is really just across the board, whether it's GMP, GCP, GLP, it doesn't matter. They're looking at it across all of the areas now. Oh. Sorry, I lost my screen for a second. The revised Chapter 4 of Annex 11 talks about the documentation requirements for regulated systems is much more detailed now and more prescriptive than 21 CFR Part 11 is. So we're starting to find regulations prescribing how we should address the regulations, not just telling us that we have to address them any way we can. It's highly likely in the future, as the FDA develops its next interpretation of Part 11, that they're going to harmonize with Annex 11. So as the FDA grows and comes up with its next interpretation, I think you're going to see that it adopts a number of the new, more prescriptive regulations. Regulated laboratories are going to be front and center in needing to update their policies and procedures in order to come into compliance and maintain compliance. Some of the really common areas and processes where we often see non-compliances in a laboratory environment occur when you're looking at lab equipment, the calibration and calibration records, preventive maintenance, the validation of the computer systems in the lab, in their standard operating procedures, including lab records and data sheets. In the out-of-specification problems that you see, so when you have samples that don't meet specification, how you investigate out-of-spec problems, how you document them, those are areas that are addressed frequently in 483s. Training and training records, how samples are handling and the chain of custody that goes along with sample management. Samples being reanalyzed, and there's no real reason or investigation for the reanalysis. And use of legacy systems that are not compliant with Part 11. So what is a laboratory to do? How do you come into compliance and get to the point where you are now actually achieving compliance with the regulations, and what regulations that you have, understanding the regulations that you have to follow? The first thing that a lab needs to do to bring themselves into compliance is to review your policies and procedures on a regular basis and update them. Having a procedure that people are not trained on or not following is worse than not having a procedure at all. You need to make absolutely certain that you're saying what you do and you do what you say. Implement and train on risk management processes and procedures. This is huge. Risk management is recommended by the FDA across the board, and it takes you a long way to making sure that the decisions that you're making at all levels of your company are correct and that they're justified. If you can develop a usable, maintainable process and procedure for risk management, that's going to increase user acceptability of your systems. It's going to increase users' understanding of how those processes and procedures should work. Verify that you have sufficient IT processes and procedures to maintain your validated systems, and make sure that they apply to a lab. Very often, labs have a lot of standalone systems, and the data gets saved to a computer. It's up to the lab operator to make sure that they remember to back the data up or send it off to the network. The IT department should have the responsibility to implement backup and restore policies and procedures that extend out to your laboratory instrumentation. Should not rely on someone's memory. It should be an automated process that someone holds the absolute responsibility for. And when we're talking about backup and restore, this traces right to record protection under the Part 11 requirements. It includes all the data that's generated in support of your regulated activities. Your backups need to be validated, and you need to perform periodic restores in order to show that the data that you're generating is protected and recoverable. Make sure that you have configuration management procedures in place for managing the configuration of your software applications, and make sure that they extend to lab computer systems. Your analysts should not be able to go in and change a system configuration in order to make their job easier. They have to go through a prescribed process to do that. Make sure that you update and establish change management procedures. What happens? The procedures, these are procedures that control when can you upgrade, how do you upgrade, how do you make a change to your computer system. Make sure that those procedures apply to your lab computer systems. Verify that password and user account policies comply with Part 11. There have been a number of findings, especially recently, around laboratories having one username and password for an entire group in the lab, about common usernames and IDs, or people sharing usernames and passwords. It cannot happen in a regulated environment. Make sure that your data is safe and protected. Ensuring data integrity is a critical focus of lab compliance efforts and will continue to be moving forward. If you have a legacy system that does not comply with Part 11, you need to have a plan for retiring and replacing that system. And you need to have adequate procedural controls around that system that have documented evidence that you're complying with them if you're going to continue to use that legacy system. Make sure, again, establish adequate user ID controls for all lab computer systems. And you should have a list of the current and historical users of a system. There was a sighting for Concord Laboratories where managers were observed logging onto a CDS system and setting up an analysis, and then an analyst would just come in behind them using that manager's login and just doing the work, performing the analysis, but they never logged in under their own name. That's an absolute violation of Part 11. You need to be able to tell who's doing what and when. So being able to establish the identity of who's doing the work is a key compliance requirement. And that was easy in a time when we could just sign off on our notebooks. But it's not so easy now. You have to have policies and procedures in place to make sure that you can establish who did the work. Implement adequate password controls. And an adequate password control is, it has to be more than 4 letters. It needs to be something that a user can remember, but not so complicated that users have to write down their password to remember it. Walk into any laboratory, and I walk into a lot of laboratories in my position as practice leader for the lab practice at USDM, and pick up a keyboard and turn it over. And you can tell right away who's whose keyboard that is because their username and password is sitting on a yellow sticky note. So you want to make sure that a password control is rememberable. It can't be 15 letters with a combination of everything in the world, but it's got to be strong enough to be able to ensure data integrity. And that's you've got to define those limits and enforce them. Within a lab, you should have different user types and roles to limit the ability to modify data without express permission. That's a regulated requirement. Section 211.68 says that only people who are with specific permission should be able to modify an application. And so you need to make sure that you have super users and system administrators and analysts roles so that you can separate out. An analyst should not be able to go and make a change. Only certain people should be permitted to do that. Again, make sure your data is backed up regularly and make sure that it can be restored. If you don't test the restoration of data, backing it up isn't going to help. Make sure you're controlling changes to your computer systems, including the configuration of a validated system. Establish adequate training processes and procedures to make sure that every single analyst in your lab is capable of performing their jobs. Understand the predicate rules for lab records. Section 211.194, lab records shall include complete data derived from all tests necessary to assure compliance with established specifications and standards, including examinations and assays. And you can look up that section of the regulation to see the rest of it. Leave you in suspense for a while. Complete data means all the data generated, including the data that you didn't want your supervisor to see. That's part of the record. Every single test, every piece of data has to be included as a part of that record. Define and document what the electronic records are for every computer system that you have in the lab. Part 11 has always recommended that electronic records be defined for computer systems. What they haven't said is that you couldn't. They kind of said that if you define the paper record as the raw data, that was okay, but you had to define that somewhere. But Annex 11, which is now enforced, makes it a law in Europe that for electronic records, regulated users should define which data are to be used as raw data. At least all data on which quality decisions are based should be defined as raw data. And in Chapter 4, it states it should be clearly defined which record is related to each manufacturing activity and where this record is located. Secure controls must be in place to ensure integrity of that record throughout the retention period, and those controls must be validated. Many labs today, as we talked about before, define the raw data as paper. But with the implementation of the European Union Chapter 4 requirements, this is no longer an option. It specifically states that lab records are either hybrids, which means that they're part paper and part electronic, or they are all electronic. So there is no more paper only unless you simply have a printout on a thermal piece of paper. If you're using a computer system to generate a record and printing out that record, the computer system electronic record is now raw data, at least a piece of the raw data. And the reason for that is not every chromatogram, not every printout contains everything that you can find in the computer system. And some of you may be thinking the European Union Annex 11 doesn't really affect me because we don't sell anything in Europe. But if you go to the FDA website, they have this is just directly off their website. They say the printed paper copy of a chromatogram will not be considered a true copy of the entire electronic raw data used to create that chromatogram as required by 21 CFR 211-180. The printed chromatogram would also not be considered an exact and complete copy of the electronic raw data used to create the chromatogram as required by 21 CFR 211-68. For instance, it doesn't generally include the injection sequence, the instrument method, integration method, or the audit trail, all of which are used to create the chromatogram and are associated with its validity. Therefore, the chromatogram used in drug manufacturing and testing does not satisfy 21 CFR Part 11. Another thing that you can do to achieve and maintain compliance in your lab is review the audit trails. Under Annex 11, this is a requirement that every time you release a batch record, you need to review the audit trails. Make sure that nothing untoward happened during that run. You need to review periodically not only your processes and procedures, but you need to review the electronic systems that you're using, the computerized systems, and you need to make a decision as to whether or not they're still in compliance. So the validated systems that you have, a validation is a one-time act, but you've got to maintain that. And that's a big deal in maintaining compliance is periodic review. So you want to establish a review, and you want to document that you're going to do it, and you want to document whose responsibility it is. Again, this has been suggested in the past by GAMP and PICAS. It ensures that once you validate a system that you're still in compliance. So a year later, you may have made several changes to the system, and you may assess every one of those changes in its own right, but those cumulative changes over time may actually change the intended use of your system, or you may not have considered certain items that may have been affected. You want to look at the help desk records. You want to look at problems that you've had. You want to look at the changes that you've made and make a determination as to whether or not you are still in a validated state. And if not, then what do you need to do about that? So maybe it's just go back and do some regression testing. Maybe it's nothing. Maybe, it's still in a validated state for your review. But you want to make that decision formally and document it on a regular basis. Every couple of years for systems that don't have a lot of changes. If you're making changes all the time, you might want to consider an annual review. What about legacy systems? We talked a little bit about them earlier. Legacy systems that were once used for R&D but generated data that you want to use in a submission should be retrospectively validated. And what I mean by that is to look and document that the system has been in compliance over a period of time. Look at all the data that you generated. Use the data that you've already generated. Figure out how you're using the system, but document that it is in control. And that's really what you're saying here is that you want control over these systems, and that you can show that. If you can't make a legacy system compliant through an upgrade or an add-on, then you probably need to retire it and replace it. And that should be in a plan. It doesn't mean you have to do it today, but the plan should be in place for when you're going to retire it, and how you're going to retire it, and how you're going to replace it. If you can't retire a system because you need that system to access the data, you need it to generate the data that you're generating now, and I've seen a few cases where that's true, where they're just simply, it's one assay, but it's got to be run this way. It won't transfer to a new system. Then you need sufficient procedural controls in place to manage that system and to show the data integrity for the data generated by that system. And again, somehow, if you can retire the system, then you should have it in a plan and have a plan for replacing it. In summary, recent regulatory changes have made changes in how labs manage their regulatory compliance. And those changes are going to continue to affect laboratories very directly in the future. If you are engaged in regulated activity, then you need to beef up your compliance activities. You need to establish, follow, and maintain data integrity policies and procedures, especially in light of the recent findings concerning data fraud and manufacturing process issues resulting in recalled products. Labs should have a plan in place for retiring those legacy systems that cannot be brought into compliance and for procedurally controlling those systems in the interim. I've got a few references here, so feel free to look at this website. When we post it up on the website, you can see all the references and be able to check into them. And Becky, I'll hand it back to you. Thank you, everybody, for your attention.
Thanks so much, Diane. What a terrific presentation. Yeah, we will be posting the presentation, as Diane said. It takes about 24 hours for us to get the recorded session back. At this point, we would offer the floor open to questions. If you have anything you'd like me to direct to Diane, just type it in to the bottom left-hand portion of the screen. Very solid coverage of the very important topics there on laboratory compliance. Thanks again, Diane. If any of you would prefer to have a copy of the slides, just send me an email. I'm happy to get them to you as well. It's rmelody, M-E-L-E-D-Y, at usdatamanagement.com. And of course, if your questions are of a confidential nature, as is frequent in our industry, just let us know. We're happy to set up a one-on-one Q&A with you, so as to be able to address your questions without sharing with the world at large there. Give you just a moment to go ahead and type in questions if you have any. William is asking, I cannot find 21 CFR 11-168 reference in one slide.
It's 211-168. So it's CFR 211.168.
Okay, I misspoke, Diane. That is what we typed in the question. Sorry about that. What we can do is maybe get together offline and help you to find that specific reference in more detail. Happy to do that, William. I'll send you an email after the presentation wraps up today. Any other questions? Anything that we can offer direction with? Help you with any pain points, struggles in compliance? Paulina is asking, do you see any changes in the laboratory design that will be affected by the changes in compliance?
I don't see, as far as facilities design, I don't see anything that would be really affected. This is mainly directed towards computer systems, the way that you control your documentation, that kind of thing. And if you didn't mean facility design, please feel free to get with Becky and we can set up a time to talk and we can discuss that in a little bit more detail.
Thanks, Diane. We have a question asking if you could elaborate a little further and explain quality issues that affect the integrity of the data or the system.
Absolutely. The quality issues that are really out there, when the FDA issued or retracted the Part 11 requirement, they said that they were going to maintain part of it. And the biggest part that they're looking at is data integrity, and that's the safety and security of your data. So some of the, and I'm going to go back to some of my notes here and kind of go through some of the issues that have been seen and written up in not just 483s, but also warning letters. We talked during the presentation about Able Labs. Their former VP of their quality control department and 3 supervisory chemists pled guilty to falsifying and manipulating test data. Liner Laboratories falsified data about product stability and shelf life. That's the kind of thing that we're looking at. If a manager logs in under the Concord Labs warning letter issued in 2006, a manager logged into a HPLC system and set up analysis, and then the analyst came in and did the work under the manager's account. We talked a little bit about that. You can't do that because you don't know who did the work, all right? And if you don't know who's doing the work, that affects the integrity of your data. And integrity is really the believability of your data. own laboratories uses common passwords shared by 2 or more users. Again, same issue. Who really did the work? And can you trust the data if you don't know who did it? User roles and responsibilities. Concord Laboratories was written up in a warning letter that they don't have any data security protocols describing a user's roles and responsibilities in terms of what privilege they have to access, change, create, or delete projects and data. It's a huge thing if you're deleting data, because that can be considered to be falsifying the data you submit. Hopefully that answered your question, and if not, please feel free to get with Becky, and we could certainly talk further on that.
Tremendous. Thanks again, Diane. And we do want to thank you again for joining us today. We trust that the information shared has been helpful for you and your team, and we welcome any comments or feedback that can assist us with continual improvement. And of course, we're open to suggestion for future presentation topics. What pain points are you and your team facing on site today, and how can we offer a direction and solutions with you? We do encourage you to join the discussion on LinkedIn and to visit our website to review the topics for upcoming webinars across the different USDM practices. On behalf of the USDM team, we appreciate the opportunity to team with you toward excellence in compliance. Have a wonderful day.